In hindsight, I should have asked for some lemon and ginger tea with honey or something like that. Anyway, we are back. So that was early intervention. Now for early supports. A short-term program delivered by early childhood partners aimed at addressing specific concerns about a child's development and building family capacity. Enrolled provider. Enrollment reflects the review's recommendation and means a person or organization that undergoes a process of enrollment to deliver lowest risk supports under the National Disability Supports Commission. Look, I have some opinions about this, but I'm going to hold off on that for the time being. Yeah, like what it means to be an enrolled provider, who can be a provider, and what checks and balances exist. Yeah, that is a conversation. Anyway, evidence-based supports. Supports provided where there is evidence that the support is effective and beneficial for someone with similar needs and circumstance. So, in principle, I love this one. I am a big fan of evidence-based support in a lot of context, but getting that evidence, getting the type of evidence that NDIS will accept, can be problematic. The first, as I have mentioned many times in the past, is things like, hey, it can be expensive to get the medical reports and the assessments and so on and so forth, which is something that this review actually has come around and said, hey, we want to address that. But I'm facing another one, which is a lot of people do not understand the real impacts of my disability unless they actually see the impact of my disability. And it's really hard to write about the impact of my disability, as many of my care workers have found. So, to supplement that, we started taking photos. We started taking video footage. And NDIS rejects those. NDIS will not consider video footage or photos in their assessment. So they rely on the written word, and the written word cannot always successfully convey what is needed. And sometimes, especially if you've got a GP or a specialist who uses specialized language, if they're reading one of these specialized reports, they don't necessarily understand the carry-on effects or the meanings because they just don't have the context that the medical professional has. It's talking to the wrong audience. So I love the idea of evidence-based support, but when you're very restrictive on what type of evidence you even accept, that can cause problems as well. So I just kind of wanted to raise that as a thing. In particular for me, like, I have to admit, I both love and hate that my disability encounters so many of these things in a way that most other disabilities won't. I know a lot of disabled people who they've encountered issues with the NDIS, but the issues that they encounter often don't overlap with the issues that somebody else encounters, even if they're sourced from the same basic thing. But my disability, because it so massively conflicts with the system of NDIS and just what NDIS is designed to do and achieve, I constantly encounter all these little things and can easily see, because of, like, it may have a small impact on me, but it's just like, oh, that can be an even bigger impact for somebody else. This particular thing for this other disability can be a huge problem for this other person, for this other disability, so on and so forth. So while everybody's experience is different, to a certain extent I have been lucky/unlucky in that my experience has been so different that I have a little bit of insight into a lot of areas that I otherwise might not have had insight into. Plus, being autistic helps in that regard, and also doesn't help in that regard. Alright, anyway, moving on. Federation Funding Agreement. When an agreement involves funding from the Australian Government to the states and territories, it is covered under the Intergovernmental Agreement, IGA, on Federal Financial Relations to the under the IGA on federal financial relations, payments to the states are outlined through schedules to one of 5 overarching sectoral federation funding agreements or through one of the national agreements. That was a mouthful, and I just kind of want to move on from that one. Sorry. Anyway, formal safeguards, rules and actions that are taken by organizations with formal responsibilities for the safety of people with disability that are often ignored and are often not enforced and are often very, very difficult to pursue through the complaints office or through business commission or through auditing. Like, the formal safeguards often do absolutely nothing, and it can often be a bigger challenge to pursue having those formal safeguards than just dealing with the situation, which is a terrible thing to say, but we have seen that exact situation in the aged care communities before. I would really love... the wife of a friend of mine did some major studies on past issues within aged care and disability care and all that sort of thing, particularly for the 90s and early 2000s and all that sort of thing. I've been wanting to sit down and have a long conversation with her and just hear her speak for a long time. Yeah, like, a lot of the issues that we have with NDIS, these aren't new issues. A lot of them have been around for 20 to 30 years, and it's only like every... what was this? I think it was like about every 20 years is when there's some, oh, look, here's the thing, we need to do some reforms. It was less than 20 years. Regardless, there is a almost cyclical nature to this, and part of that is because a lot of the underlying structures just aren't ever addressed. And the formal safeguards is kind of one of them. If you're not enforcing those safeguards, it's just words on a page a lot of the time, especially for disabled people and the elderly and the vulnerable people who are less able to access legal supports for various reasons. Anyway, foundational supports. Disability-specific supports that are available for and benefit people with disability, families and carers outside of NDIS individual budgets. Again, relating to this, but also relating to the previous one, I just want to emphasize once again, people in rural areas and indigenous communities get the short end of the stick by a mile. They have to deal with all of the issues and then some because of geography, and cultural issues and various isms. They're just much more prevalent and much more impactful. So, yeah, like, for some people, the foundational supports and the formal safeguards, these sorts of things, are great. It's usually very telling when those things are great, because it tells you where they're not. Alright. General foundational supports. Disability-specific supports that are available to benefit all people with disability, and, where appropriate, their families and carers, and people aged over 65. This includes information and advice and peer support. Group homes. Homes where multiple people with disability, often 5 or more, live together under a single roof and receive support. They usually have a separate room for a support worker to provide on-site overnight assistance. Apart from staff, only people with disability reside in the dwelling. Each person has their own bedroom, while common areas like a kitchen, bathroom, or dining room are shared with all the people living in the home. Group homes are generally provider-led, where the rhythm of everyday life is dictated by staff and service providers, and residents have little or no say over who they choose to live with. Wow. Who they choose to live with, but have little or no say, that is a contradiction right there, that I just read out in this document. But no, that is a real issue. I had to investigate that a bit myself, because in my last review, one of the things that my OT had been going to recommend was for me to go into one of these group homes, and I had to spell it out exactly why that wouldn't work. And there were a bunch of little reasons why that wouldn't work, but the big one was hey, if I have an episode, how many care workers are in the building? 1. So when I have an episode for however, like 3, 5, 8 hours, however many hours my episode lasts for, nobody else has a care worker. Also, if I want to leave the house for any reason, nobody else has a care worker. Group homes, depending on your disability, can be great. But for others, they are a cheap way to look like the government is, that NDIS is providing 24-hour care without actually providing 24-hour care. Because after all, if you're paying one person to look after 5 people, and all of those 5 people require one-on-one 24-hour care, it looks like they're getting it on paper, but in reality, they're not necessarily getting it at all. So, this is not to say that this isn't a good plan for other disabilities. This isn't to say that it isn't amazing for some people, and that it can't, it can be very, very helpful and very, very beneficial. But there are holes, and sometimes this can be misapplied and misused. And when you take a look at things on the basis of somebody who A, doesn't understand the disabled experience, and B, is going, oh yes, things must be reasonable and necessary, it's very easy to go, but you've got a 24-hour care worker. You know, that's reasonable, that's whatever. Yeah, I've had that conversation. Quote-unquote, I won that conversation, but winning that conversation didn't help me, because they didn't have an alternative that they thought that they could actually justify. They didn't think that NDIS would accept any other proposal, because NDIS didn't recognize my disability to begin with. So, that was a thing. I know I'm spending a lot of time talking about my disability and my experiences. Obviously, those are the things that I am most familiar with, and I've already said of how I've kind of been lucky/unlucky in that a lot of the issues that I've had the opportunity to see affect other people, and I've got the capacity to see that, and I have a lot of people who I do talk to, but naturally, I am more familiar with my own experiences than I am of other people's. I have read other people's, I have listened to other people, but obviously I'm simply much more knowledgeable about my own. So I try and err on the side of that. That isn't to say that my issues are even the most prevalent or most egregious. A lot of my issues are on the lighter end of the spectrum. There are people who I managed to get out of that situation that I just proposed, of saying, hey, a group home is not a good solution. Other people, it was never the solution, and they had to do it. That is what they ended up having to do and getting stuck with, because they weren't necessarily able to get out of that situation. Many of them are still in that situation, and quite a few news reports and stuff on the ABC, a lot of them actually revolve around things like group homes and independent living arrangements and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, that a lot of abuses happen in that sort of a setup. Anyway, I have a message from a human. Important to remember, the Disability Royal Commission recommended group homes not be used for people with disabilities. I actually forgot that. Yes, you're absolutely right. It was actually a recommendation by the Disability Commission. That was... Thank you. I completely blanked out on that one. Thank you very much for reminding me of that point. Just as a reminder for anybody who missed it earlier, I can't see the Twitch conversation. It's not showing up for some reason. I do not know why. It seems to be an error with Twitch or OBS or something, or both. But I can see Facebook posts and Facebook comments perfectly fine. So, apologies if anybody has been talking over Twitch. Moving on. Housing and... Hang on. Group homes, home community programs. Whoops, I almost skipped that. Home and community programs. State and territory programs that deliver lower intensity disability care supports, such as personal and domestic assistance, including cooking and cleaning, to support people with disability live as independently as possible. Programs are targeted at people with disability aged under 65 and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, people aged under 50 who do not have an NDIS individualized budget. I want to take the opportunity to talk about something tangentially related to this, and that is the notion of living as independently as possible when you are dependent on having other people do your cooking and cleaning. These words do make sense within context and their usage, but it can be confusing when this sort of thing isn't explained. I remember when I was doing the original application, and me being autistic and going, okay, what is the literal meaning of this word? What is the correct meaning of this word? And trying to understand both what they were asking and what they were intending to ask. And so many times I would find statements about, you need, what are your goals for independent living and so on and so forth. And I just get stuck on the thought of, I don't have those goals. I am fully aware that I will never be truly independent. I will always be reliant. Like, I'm reliant on somebody to open the front door to check the mailbox or to get me food. Because it's a hazard for me to open the front door. And, I have been found in the streets. I've been found in the middle of the road. I have been hit by cars. Partially because in an episode, I can't necessarily comprehend what a car is. So, I know that I will always be dependent. For me, personally, what I want to be is not dependent on my family. And that, to me, is not the same as being independent. But the way that these words are used obviously doesn't always match how one might read them in common parlance, which is why I'm, reading the glossary like this is so important, because sometimes things like this, especially if you're disabled or if you just come from a slightly different culture or you just have a different read of a particular word, it can completely change your understanding of whatever it is that they're asking you. And to be fair, sometimes the people writing the questions do not word things very well and write things in an ambiguous, unclear way. It's not always a good system, and they don't even always follow their own logic, because sometimes the people writing these questions didn't understand what they were writing to begin with. Usually, though, the error is just a different use of the word. Not always, but often it is. But that is a rant that is probably going to be more applicable if I ever talk about actual specific forms and actual specific things on those forms. I have some rants about that, but I just wanted to kind of raise... it looks like there's a contradiction there if you think about it, but within context, no it isn't, but it's still easy for that to be believed to be there. And because you can believe it to be there, it is there in practice. So, yeah. Moving on. Housing and living. In this report, we use the term housing and living rather than home and living to directly recognize that there are two distinct but interrelated components to the supports of interest to this review. Housing supports, i.e. accommodation and the built environment, and living supports, i.e. support to assist participants with activities of daily living. When working together well, these housing and living supports should create a sense of home for people with disability. Okay, I will accept that. If I was going to talk more about this, it would be more about, okay, let's talk about how budget allocations work, but I've kind of talked about that a few times to a greater or lesser extent, so I think we can move on. Inclusive and accessible. Inclusion is where everyone is treated equally and has an active role in society. Inclusive and accessible services and communities ensure people with disability can access appropriate support and participate as equal members of society. the one thing I want to call up on here is has an active role in society. It is not a disabled person's responsibility to be active in society, and it is not the role of government or any outsider force to force such a person to be an active role in society. I know that that's not necessarily what is intended to be meant here, but that is how it is sometimes interpreted, is that the goals of NDIS is to get you back into the workforce, it's to get you going to these things, it's to get you going to the, training and so on and so forth. And quality of life and or the actual goals and desires of the participant may not match those things, or what the disabled person considers an active role in society does not match what the provider thinks that should be. And that actually causes problems, actual real problems. In fact, it was quoted as an issue in some of those group home abuses I mentioned earlier, because, hey, we're forcing, or, we're taking these disabled people out to do these active events, so it looks good on paper, it's making their condition worse. And that would be the case for me in a lot of circumstances as well. But this is important to have, but it still comes back to it should be the disabled person's choice, or, and this is what I would love to see here, is encouraged to have an active role in society, but doesn't have to. As much as it's often ineffectual, I do appreciate the fact that at least one of my care workers does try and figure out, hey, how can I assist Alan to be a more active participant? How can I assist him to go and do the things that he wants to do? How can I assist him to do X, Y, Z? What can I do in my capacity to support Alan where he wants to be supported? And that is great. Other care workers just take a back seat and wait for me to say something, wait for me to tell them what I'm looking for and what I want. And both approaches are fine. Both approaches are appreciated. Sometimes I appreciate one approach more than the other. But a statement like this can be seen as specifically promoting one side of that equation than the other. And there are plenty of other approaches as well. At the end of the day, a lot of disabled people are introverts, and a lot of disabled people, even if they weren't naturally introverts, have learned to become introverts as a result of their disability, and phobias are a thing. And if you're focusing on being an active role in society before addressing the phobia or addressing those barriers, that can be a problem. So there is potential. It's not inherent, but there is potential. Well, actually, it is arguably inherent with the way it's worded, but there is the potential for that confusion, misapplication. I'm looking for a word here, but I've said enough other words. You get what I'm saying here. That disjoint between action delivered and quality of life, and action desired and appropriateness. Anyway, moving onwards. Individual budgets. NDIS funding that is individually determined and made available to a single person, but not by the individual. I cannot stress that enough. I'm not actually, here's the thing. The individual should have a voice in this process. I am not specifically saying that the individual should get to decide their own budget. I would love that, but I can understand arguments against that, especially on the basis of the legislation as it currently stands. It can be changed, and it can be changed for the better, absolutely. But the fact that we have basically no voice at the moment is a fundamental problem, and there is no reason why we can't and shouldn't have a voice and actually be invited to present our thoughts as part of the process. Yeah. The idea that we have to go to freaking tribunal just to be able to have that voice, which is a lengthy, prolonged, arduous, and not necessarily accessible process. That is a problem. Just to have a voice. That is a fundamental problem. Anyway, information linkages and capacity building. ILC is a set of supports designed to increase the capacity of people with disability, their families, and carers to achieve their goals and increase the capacity of the community to be more inclusive. Originally, ILC was known as Tier 2. In-kind programs. Some pre-existing programs funded and provided by governments would provide reasonable and necessary supports to people with disability on behalf of the NDIS. When these supports are provided to an NDIS participant, the government that delivers the service receives a discount to their contributions to the NDIS, to the value of the supports provided to the participants, i.e. the cost of the service provided to the participant is considered an in-kind contribution to the NDIS. Oh, that was a mouthful, and my brain actually kind of stopped working while reading that. So let me just reread that for myself. I apologize. Okay, cool. That is another conversation point for another time. This I'm expecting will come up again in the reviews, and I'll take the opportunity to talk about it then. If it doesn't come up in the review, I will make a note to actually talk about this probably when I finish the review, which who knows how long that will be. Intergenerational report. The Intergenerational Report is produced by the Australian Government. It projects outlooks for the Australian economy and the Australian Government budgets over the next 40 years. It examines the long-term sustainability of current policies and how demographic, technological, and other structural trends may affect the economy and the budget. When was the last one of those? I don't remember. I'll have to double-check when the last one of those was and when the next one is going to be. Anyway, Intergovernmental Agreement. An intergovernmental agreement, IGA, is an agreement made between the Australian Government and state and territory governments. While IGAs are not legally binding, they express the commitment of governments to work together on certain objectives or goals. So, it's basically policy for all intents and purposes. Intermediary. An individual or organisation who acts as a middle person in assisting participants to interact or engage with others, including providers. Intermediaries in the NDIS include roles such as local area coordinators, early childhood partners, support coordinators, remote community connectors, and plan managers. I recently had a conversation with someone who didn't understand why they needed a local area coordinator, and it's a bit of a problem. There are some good reasons for intermediaries to exist, but there are some, from the outside, there looks to be a number of problems, and I don't know how valid these problems really are, to be perfectly honest, but it definitely looks like there are significant problems. The first one is that a lot of the time, these intermediaries, they look like their sole purpose is to keep participants away from the NDIS, so that we can't talk directly to the NDIS. If we have a question, it goes to an intermediary, and that intermediary gets to paraphrase whatever our question was on our behalf to somebody within the NDIS. And the NDIS can respond to the intermediary and can lie to the intermediary, and the intermediary may or may not pursue that and may not be willing and able to pursue that. Some intermediaries are not willing to challenge the NDIS on anything that they say. Others are. And you end up with this weird situation because it's a middle management situation where it's just like, as the participant, it feels like you're talking to thin air because the person you're talking to is just an intermediary and may not have the answers and could be weeks before they're able to respond to you. And you have no idea the veracity of what they're saying, and or whether they've been told the truth or whatever. I have had this direct experience where my intermediary was told one thing very clearly, and we were actively celebrating, and their department was celebrating a victory on my case. And then when the plan actually arrived, it wasn't there. It had been erased. So whatever my intermediary had been told was either A, a lie, or B, they were told that, and then they took it out. And so what the information my intermediary had became false, if it wasn't false already. And then it becomes very hard to pursue that, and it becomes very hard to follow up on that, and it becomes very hard to this, that, and the other. So there is that sense that the intermediary is deliberately placed to put some space between the participant and the NDIS, and to make accountability much harder because you've added more people to divide accountability across. But the other problem is a lot of these are volunteers and charitable organizations and groups that could go defunct and that could just like have not necessarily have their own biases and motivations, but these groups have different relationships with the NDIS and with the NDIA. And because of that, your intermediary, you will get a different experience depending on who your intermediary is. It becomes a very, very variable, I'll just use that word, experience. So my experiences can be different from somebody else's, which is different from somebody else's, and sometimes there's very little choice in what intermediary you can even have, and the choice is basically forced on you due to factors of geography or availability, and other times you can have plenty of choice, but the choices that you have to select from may not be very helpful. So, and there are probably reasons. I don't know why this is necessary, because it seems to me that it's, in a sense, they've privatized this part of the business. Like, the intermediaries, it's just like, oh yeah, we have the public system. The public system just makes the decisions and receives the information. But it's a private organization that the participant has to organize themselves through in order to access the NDIS. Oh, I want to submit my application to be on the NDIS. I have to access this charity, or this private organization, or this other intermediary that is not actually part of the public system. It's part of the private system, in order to access the public system. And the fact that in order to access the public system, you have to go through a private system is a problem. It would be like if you had to hire a lawyer in order to access Centrelink. Which isn't the worst idea in the world sometimes, but it's that, yeah, it's that degree of separation. And I don't know why that's necessary. There may be very, very good reasons for it. One of those reasons, quite simply, is sometimes disabled people need support. They need help. They need advisors. They need somebody who can read the document to them, for them, and interpret it for them. And those things are very important. But why are those things not provided by the NDIS? Why is that provided by a private enterprise, or a charity, or a company, or an organization that is itself separate from the NDIS? Yeah, that is an issue that I believe exists. I have seen it from the outside, but I have limited understanding of the internal justifications for it. Anyway, somebody has said something. Oh, yeah, that's another... Oh, yes, that is such a big one. Sorry. You also don't see the intermediaries' reports, which are what the NDIS make decisions on. That is absolutely true. you don't get to know what was actually communicated on your behalf. You're not allowed to be part of email correspondences with the NDIS by your intermediary. They often do not provide you, even if it was written, a copy of whatever was said, discussed, whatever. And of course, if they're doing it by phone call, they don't have transcripts, they don't have recordings, so you have no idea what the intermediary has said on your behalf. And that can be a really huge problem, especially if your intermediary is overworked and they forget a detail about your case, or choose not to say a particular detail about your case. And on top of that, and I have actually heard this one time and time again. Thank you for bringing up that point. I've heard this one time and time again. Because intermediaries have different ways that they like to deal with the NDIS, you end up with situations where, how was it put? Some intermediaries don't want to rock the boat. Because they're dealing with multiple clients, they are aware that if they fight hard for one of their clients that they believe deserves the support, but if they anger the person on the other end, it damages the chances for all their other clients, because now that the intermediary has a bad reputation with the NDIS, or with the provider, or with whoever. So the intermediaries are incentivized, fundamentally incentivized, to construct positive relationships that benefit the NDIS and the providers, not the client. And that's partly because they're not really independent. And at the same time, they're not actually part of the NDIS, and there is a enforced separation between all of their actions and their relationship with the NDIS and you. I've been able to easily get copies of correspondence between my provider and my LAC and so on and so forth. Like, I am often involved in that side of the conversation, but the other side of the conversation, nope, not at all. So thank you for pointing that one out, and reminding me of all of those other points. Yeah. As I said, there may be some justification for intermediaries, some inherent justification for intermediaries in all cases that I am not aware of. I can think of justification for why intermediaries need to be an option, but I don't see why they should be anything other than optional. The only reason that I think that you can make an argument for why it needs to be mandatory is an economic one, which underlies a lot of the economic theory of the NDIS, which is, hey, if you don't have every participant on this system, then nobody will willingly be an intermediary, and you won't have anybody, like, nobody's going to step up to form a private company or a charity that actually provides this service. And you know why? Because this is a service that should be coming from the public sector, not the private sector to begin with. But that is a problem with the economic setup of NDIS, and a big part of why I keep saying a lot of the problems of NDIS fundamentally come from the economics of the NDIS. And even if you change a lot of stuff on paper, even if you make a lot of recommendations, even if you make a lot of structural changes, if you do not change the economic side of it, you will create the same system. So, yeah. Anyway, lead practitioner. Oh, yeah, and thank you again for your comments. They have been very helpful. Lead practitioner, an allied health, developmental, or early childhood educator who is the main professional working with the family. They help coordinate the team around the child, provide information and advice, emotional support, identify and address needs, and support the family to develop self-advocacy skills. I cannot see any problem in anything that was just listed there, and that is not an area of the NDIS that I am particularly familiar with. So if there are any issues, I'm not familiar with it, but it doesn't look like there may be issues in the application of that, but it doesn't look like there's issues in at least at this level of what has been written down. LGBTIQA plus SB. I won't read that, but it's hopefully everybody knows what that is and knows why that is important and why that's in here for consideration. Local area coordinators, a contractor funded by the NDIA to deliver a range of coordination services in a particular location to people with disability aged 9 or older and their families. Longitudinal data. Longitudinal data refers to a dataset where observations regarding a given individual, business, or other unit of observation is collected repeatedly over time. This is often also referred to as panel data. A balanced panel implies that for each time period in the sample, there are a complete set of observations for each individual or observational unit in the panel. An unbalanced panel refers to the situation where not every individual or observational unit may record the full set of observations in every time period. I'm just trying to get through all of this as quickly as possible. This has already been a long time. Anyway, mainstream services. Mainstream services, also known as universal or essential services, are government services outside the NDIS that all Australians can access and benefit from, regardless of whether or not they have a disability. They include things like healthcare, education, transport, and employment services. And as I said before, significant parts of the NDIS are intentionally or unintentionally designed to provide access to mainstream services, partly because, as some people have said who are in a more position to know, it is because that is just the limits of the understanding of the people who developed the NDIS. They're just thinking, oh yeah, just get them, what steps need to be taken to get the disabled person onto mainstream? And they just had a very limited understanding of what those steps even were. So yeah, this is often seen as being an end goal, and that's not necessarily what the end goal should be. It's not necessarily a goal or appropriate. But that is going to change based on an individualized case-by-case basis, and some people that won't be an issue for, some people it is an issue for. Market stewardship. The market stewardship role of governments is to support informed participant choice, continuous improvement in service quality and effectiveness, access to quality supports, and appropriate regulation and safeguards for people with disability. A number of government agencies have a market stewardship role of NDIS markets. If and or when I talk about economics and, regulation and that sort of thing, whether intentionally or unintentionally, these guys are implicated in pretty much everything I say, either positively or negatively. Some things they've done have been good. Other things are, do you even exist at all? Did you even stop and think, even for a second, about what you created? Because sometimes, you look at what is there and you go, how is this not abuse written in? Like, how is that not abuse? At the economic level, at the baseline economic level. There's a bunch of moments like that when reading through, like, the NDIS Priceline guidelines and so on and so forth. It's just like, why would you do this? It's easier to see the abuses than it is to see why you would want this. And that's not saying that there aren't good reasons for it to be there, depending on what we're talking about, but it's a problem when it's so much easier to see ways to abuse the system than to actually use the system correctly. Alright, Medicare, Australia's universal health insurance scheme that provides guaranteed access to a wide range of health and hospital services at low or no cost, and absolutely needs a boost. Like, one of the biggest issues with NDIS, and I have to give the Labor government credit for trying. They tried to increase the Medicare levy to pay for NDIS. Like, they correctly said at the time when they were pushing for NDIS, we also need to introduce an increase to the Medicare levy in order to pay for NDIS. And that was voted out. It didn't, that part of the, that didn't happen. They voted against Liberal and Independents, and they voted against, and some of Labor as well, I believe, But it didn't pass. So they didn't properly fund NDIS from the moment of its inception. It was inadequately funded, and they knew it because the government rejected plans to create proper funding measures. Um, so yeah, the Labour government tried, absolutely tried to get an appropriate amount of funding and failed. And this comes back to what I had been saying earlier about, hey, some of these package deals, these things rely upon each other. Yeah, would we have such a huge NDIS blowout if it had been correctly funded by the people who were trying to get it correctly funded, but it got rejected? Like, these things come as a package deal. You should not... Well, it's not quite that you should not be having one without the other, but obviously it's so much better when you have one without the other. And so many of our issues, a lot of them come from the fact that this package was not taken. Continuing forwards, multilateral agreement. A multilateral agreement is an agreement between the Australian government and more than one other party. Within disability, multilateral agreements are agreements between the Australian government and more than one state and/or territory. National Agreement on Closing the Gap. The National Agreement on Closing the Gap 2020 is a commitment by all Australian governments and First Nations people, as represented by a coalition of peaks, to work in new ways to drive better outcomes. These outcomes are represented through the 4 priority reforms and 17 socio-economic targets. I do not believe that NDIS actually realistically assists with that, but I need to take a look at the latest budgets from that angle before I seriously make that argument. But hopefully that will actually be covered in the review itself. So hopefully the research I'm going is this reading right here. Anyway, the National Cabinet. National Cabinet is formed for the Prime Minister, blah, blah, blah. National Injury Insurance Scheme, a program designed alongside the NDIS to provide lifetime care and support on a no-fault basis to individuals who suffer a catastrophic injury resulting in substantial and permanent disability, intended to be established for 4 types of injuries: motor vehicle accidents, workplace accidents, medical accidents, and general accidents occurring in home or community. National Safeguards. Actions and features that are part of people's day-to-day lives and support them to manage their safety, also called informal safeguards. So, this is a problem. Actually a huge problem within NDIS. I had actually expected it to come up earlier, to be honest. As in I expected informal safeguards to be much earlier, and informal care and all that sort of thing. One of the fundamental problems with the NDIS is that they make assumptions that they should not make. For example, the NDIS actively assumes that family members will provide support for disabled people, regardless of the pressures on that family and the relationship that that family actually has, and the desires and goals of the participant. For example, my budget at the moment is cut down because I live with my family, and it's just assumed that my 70-year-old parents can physically look after me. That's ignoring all of their issues. They might, I won't go into their medical history, but they have some serious medical issues, but also 70s. Why would anybody expect 70-year-olds to provide primary informal care above and beyond that which care workers provide? And that is what my plan currently assumes and is based on. And I am not the only person who has dealt with that. I remember straight after the budget announcement back in May, there was a meeting between a whole lot of disabled people, organised by a senator to actually discuss, and I'll say their name, Senator George Steelejohn. Fantastic. But there was the big meeting to kind of discuss, okay, what are some of these implications? What do they mean? They had somebody, I forget who it was, from the Liberal officers to actually come and have a conversation with disabled people and answer some questions. Not necessarily successfully for them, but one of the stories that was brought up at that time was somebody who, their plan was changed because when the review came on, the reviewer went, "Oh, you've still got living parents? Yeah, they'll provide some more support than is currently listed." And so they reduced the plan on the completely baseless assumption that the parents would take over some amount of the care. The parents didn't even live with the disabled person. There was basically, it was crazy that decision was made so arbitrarily. And that happened, when that happened was immediately after, if I recall correctly, they got that information immediately after the budget was released, but the decision was made before the budget was released. But that sort of thing happens all the time currently. I have encountered that not only in my own case examples, but it's actually one of the most common complaints I've come across is assumptions being made about what informal supports are going to be received by the disabled person, and that is often unreasonable, especially when the person providing the so-called informal supports is disabled themselves. A friend of mine actually told me a story recently. This is more NDIS adjacent, but it very much is telling of the mentality. She's got 2 autistic kids, and the professional was, I'm pretty sure it was in the context of NDIS and a developmental consultant, something like that. But the professional was saying, okay, well, you need to teach the kids these social skills. And my friend was just like, I'm autistic. I don't have those skills. How am I supposed to teach my kids the skills that I don't have? I don't even know what those skills are to begin with. And they were stumped. They didn't have an answer for it because it was just like, oh, it just wasn't in their mind that the mother would not be equipped to teach, the disabled mother would not be able to teach their disabled kids the skills that disabled people don't usually have. And, those sorts of assumptions are common. They are so, so common. And that's a big part of when I say things, or when we disabled people, or just anybody says something like, the disabled experience is different from the abled experience. And this is true for, of course, any demographic to another demographic, really. But when we say these things, that is the sort of thing we're talking about. Assumptions just get made, and those assumptions are completely wrong and baseless, and they often dictate what supports are allocated to us because we don't get a voice in the allocation of those supports. And this is why not only having a voice is so important, but why the people making these decisions, A, need to be better informed, and B, should actually have a background in medicine or disability or something. They should not just be random business people who've been appointed to the job, which is often the case. Anyway, natural settings, places where children live, play, and learn, like the family home, school, or early childhood education and care or community. I didn't know natural settings applied exclusively to children. That might actually change how I've read some things in the past. That's odd that it applies exclusively to children. Anyway, NDIS Independent Advisory Council. The Independent Advisory Council, IAC, is established under Part 3 of the National Disability Insurance Scheme and represents the participants' voice in the NDIS. The IAC has a statutory function to advise the NDIA board on most important issues affecting participants, carers, and families. The Advisory Council is good and all, but it does have the problem that it is very broad and wide-reaching. It's like trying to talk to the state or federal government about local community issues. a lot of the time it is just much bigger and much higher, and is trying to deal with broader things rather than specific things, or it tries to deal with specific things that don't impact the broader things. Like it's again, it's a great thing to have. It's important to have, but it's not the be all and end all. And this isn't really a problem with it. Like, it's important to know where it sits and how it interacts and what place it can and can't have on this whole thing. It has done some good things, absolutely, but access and results, it's not necessarily the correct way to do things. Depending on what your situation is, it very much varies. It very much depends. To be honest, I think all of what I just said was kind of pointless. I feel like a lot of that was kind of obvious to anybody who I just read that out to, or anybody who has ever had to access, use, or was just familiar with that in the past. So I guess moving on. NDIS Outcomes Framework. Surveys that measure the outcomes of NDIS participants and their family members and supporters over time. The surveys ask NDIS participants about how their lives are changing in areas like daily living, choice and control, health, well-being, relationships, community participation, work and learning. Family members and supporters are also asked about their experiences while caring for a person in the scheme. I have mixed opinions about these surveys. I've looked at them in the past, and sometimes I feel just the way that they're worded and what they're asking. It's hard to say whether sometimes it's, oh, hey, you wrote that question wrong, or no, you intentionally wrote that question to get this sort of a response. Like, you're deliberately obfuscating or not testing for certain elements. But the problem is that you can make that argument against any survey that exists, because we all have different values and different priorities and different things that we think that these surveys should be for. The problem, I think, with some of these surveys, in my opinion, is that they don't come anywhere close to meeting some of the international standards in regards to this sort of thing. And that is where I think some of the issue lies, is that, hey, we do have some international standards, and this isn't actually meeting them. Whether or not you agree with those international standards and or so on and so forth, that is a different conversation. Anyway, nominees. A person appointed to act for or make decisions on behalf of a participant. Nominees can be appointed by participants or courts and can be child representatives, correspondence nominees, or plan nominees. Nominees are very important to this whole system, and I don't know what the level of protections are around this, as in, hey, you've appointed somebody as a nominee to make decisions on your behalf. That's great, but what boundaries are there to that power? What extent there is? I'm not actually 100% familiar with that, and I should be, because my mother is my main nominee, but I've given, like, she has a lot of permissions that a lot of other people wouldn't have, for a bunch of different reasons, not least of which including, hey, if I have a medical appointment and I have an episode, somebody needs to have the right to talk on my behalf and make decisions on my behalf. And that is my mother. So I don't necessarily actually know where the boundaries are, because whatever boundaries there are for my mother are much, much wider and much further reaching than what I expect would be normal. So this is, like, what issues there are in this system, I don't actually know that, but it is, custodianship systems are known to have issues in a lot of areas, especially healthcare and old age care. Custodianship, grifting is a problem. So I don't know how much that actually affects NDIS participants. it's not a thing that I've actually encountered much. So it may not be a huge problem. I don't... I know there was something on it in the commission, but I don't remember what that was, what there was about that. So if somebody happens to know, please say something, because I'd love to actually give some commentary on that, either positively or negatively. If we are doing it fantastically in this country, I really want to turn around and say, we're doing a good job here, and this is fantastic. Nominees should be, and often are, fantastic. I just don't know if that is the majority of cases, and I don't know what are the common abuses or the common risks in Australia's case. Ironically, I think I know more about the American issues here than I do the Australian ones. Anyway, participant. A person who meets the NDIS access requirements. Participant journey. The path of interactions a person who meets the NDIS access requirements takes to access NDIS-funded supports. Participant pathways. The interactions that a participant experiences in relation to the NDIS. This includes learning about the NDIS, applying for the scheme, and planning. Participant service guarantee. The Participant Service Charter includes timeframes for the NDIS processes set out under the Participant Service Guarantee and legislated through the NDIS Act. The NDIA must make decisions about access, plan approvals, plan reviews, and nominee changes within these timeframes. This gives participants, families, and carers greater certainty about how long processes will take. Each quarter, the agency reports against Participant Service Guarantee timeframes in the quarterly report. They have failed every single time in my case. Like, every single complaint that either I have issued or has been issued on my behalf, which that is a problem. Several complaints were issued on my behalf without my consent. By people who were completely unrelated to me within government offices in particular. It was a huge problem, and that never, ever got satisfactorily resolved. But also in things like, hey, I've applied for a review. They have X amount of time to actually respond to that review. Every single time they have failed. And it's not just every single time that they failed, it's, hey, here is, you need to respond acknowledgement within this time frame. It didn't come within that time frame. Okay, taken from when they did actually send the acknowledgement. When was the next part of the response? Did not happen within that time frame. When did the resolution happen? Did not happen within that time frame. Like, even when you extend it out and just go, okay, we're taking it from here from now, and we're just going to ignore the failings of the previous steps in the process. They still failed the next step in the process. And that has been almost every single step of the NDIS. I think the only time when I actually had something within the correct bounds was in the original application, after which they made me, because they would refuse to accept my catatonia, they, resent me the paperwork, add some additional paperwork to say, please redo this on the basis of your autism because we won't accept your catatonia. Which I appreciate that they did that. Like, I appreciate that they told me, I actually got a phone call and they told me directly that my catatonia would not be accepted, even though they understood that it kind of should have been, but it would not be accepted. But they said, we want you to reapply on the basis of your autism, prove that you've got level 2 or level 3 autism, and if you can prove that, we'll get you onto the NDIS. But at that point, I had a whole lot of issues, and there was a whole lot of back and forth, and a whole lot of wait time. And if I recall correctly, I'm not 100% certain, because that period was very filled with episodes, and my sense of time was not good at that point. But if I recall correctly, it still came late. And pretty much every single time I've dealt with the NDIS after that point, it has been late every single step. So, the Participant Service Guarantee, yeah, constant failures on that part. Some comments from people. I agree, NDIS don't follow timeframes, not even within complex planning teams. Absolutely. And here's the thing, to a certain extent, especially after the May budget. Like, after the May budget came out, oh boy, they were flooded. I completely understand that, you know, the workload increases at times and it gets bigger, and sometimes those timeframes are impossible to meet. I get that. What I do not approve of at all is the fact that the participant is not updated. There is no, like, I completely get, oh, hey, look, I know that you promised to get back to me within 2 weeks. It might take you 2 months. Could you tell me that? Could you send me an email at any point within those 2 weeks and say, we are really sorry, we are not going to meet the participant service guarantee. The expected time at the moment that you should receive a response by is X and Y. If you wish to pursue this further, these are who you need to contact. You know, the complaints ombudsman, the dedicated legal aid stuff. Like, I can't remember the name of it, but still, the point is, like, just give me that update. Just give me the courtesy of informing me that it is going to be late, so that I can plan around that if necessary. But they don't do that. They just leave you in this limbo for weeks and even months, making you question whether the issue was on your end. Did you fail to send the paperwork? Did you sign something wrong? Did you do something incorrectly? And you can contact them, or you can contact your intermediary to try and find out. And often you won't get a response. So the level of anxiety that can produce is immense. Oh, more comments. I've consistently had to put in a complaint to get a response within 28 days because they just ignore me and my coordinator. Yeah. Yeah. And also, isn't it less than 28 days? Isn't it like 20 days? Like, I know some things are actually within 14 days. Like, even within 28 days, I think that is, depending on what, what particular things you're trying to pursue them for, because the timelines do vary depending on what you're asking, or if you're talking to the complaints office or whatever. But yeah, 28 days is quite long, even for their standards. So yeah, yeah. Always, all the time, this is failing. And to my knowledge, there's no punitive measures at all. At all. For the NDIS, for the department, for the intermediaries. Because here's the thing. If the as an example of, hey, they're late, and are they actually late? My last review, when it was originally submitted, it was submitted sometime between May the 22nd and May the 28th. I don't know when between those dates it was submitted. I just know that everything was compiled and everything was given to my intermediary on the 22nd. But it wasn't until the 28th that I got real confirmation that something had been submitted previously. So, when it took, a few weeks for me to get a response, it was like, well, it's already past the 2-week mark if it's the 22 days. Do I have to wait another 7 days before I can actually say it's late? Or is it actually late? And so, there is that sort of obfuscation on what even the timeline is sometimes, and they still, with an extra week of leeway, because I didn't know, they still managed to be late with that week of leeway. So, yeah. I believe if NDIS staff were held accountable for harm they caused, they'd actually do their job well. I want to say yes. The problem I have with that is, because I really want to say yes, the problem I have with that is, how do you execute that? How do you actually enforce that? Without causing a high turnover rate within the NDIS, which would harm everybody. And without people in the NDIS making decisions purely based on self-preservation that doesn't benefit the participant. So I want to say I agree with you, but but depending on how that's implemented, that could actually cause more problems. But yeah, there is a certain amount of balancing act. But you know what would be a lot easier? If you didn't have to have all of these private intermediaries and private providers. If it was a public system with clear accountability, then you could absolutely actually go, hey, the reason for this is right here. It is this part of the thing. These harms were caused. Somebody is actually responsible for these harms. That would be great and wouldn't necessarily induce a high turnover rate. But if you've got it so diffused, and the problem could be on the side of, if the problem is your intermediary, for instance, you don't want the NDIS staff being blamed for something your intermediary did. But because it's so invisible and so hard to prove, and it's so divided and so this and so that, it could be multiple parties, it could be one party, and if you allocate the harm incorrectly, it could damage a lot of other people. Even if your case gets resolved, now a lot of other people won't get resolved. So, it's terrible. It is a very bad system. This is a consequence of that system. There should be a better system. And there are better systems. Accountability is so important. And right now, we don't have effective accountability. So, yeah. Yeah, I realize I've kind of gone, hey, I kind of half disagree, but I completely agree, but I half disagree. It's all about the execution, not about the principle. So, person with disability. A person who has any or all of the following: impairments, activity limitations, difficulties in carrying out usual age-appropriate activities, and participation restrictions, problems a person may have taking part in a community, social, and family life. It's a very broad definition. I'm not opposed to it, but it's not sitting perfectly right with me, but I'm not actually putting my finger on why. It feels too broad, but for something like this, we want it to be broad. So I'm not sure. I'm honestly not sure what it is that isn't sitting right with me. I will probably come back to this at some point in the future and be like, oh, this was what was not sitting right with me about this. But I can't. I feel like there's something here, but there may actually be nothing here. It may just be a residual. I have seen this being written so badly in the past that some part of my brain just expects it to be in here. So if somebody does see a problem with this, please actually say it, because that'll probably trigger me into thinking, oh, right, that's what's not sitting right with me. But right now, that does look okay to me. Alright, we are going to take a short pause here, and the reason we're going to take a short pause here is because it looks like my phone has gone flat, which means I can't see any Facebook comments. But fortunately, my phone only takes 10 minutes to charge to full, so we are going to pause the stream for like 2 minutes. My phone is going to charge 30-40%, and then we will continue. So we'll be back with personal care in schools in a moment. See you soon.